Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Connie Lester, and I am the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. If you are new to these podcasts, you may also want to visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook. We have added a new feature to the Facebook page and now include abstracts of each of the quarterly articles, beginning with Volume 90. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. James M. Mike Denham. Dr. Denham is a professor at Florida Southern College in Lakeland and director of the Lawton M. Chiles Center for Florida History. He is the author of A Rogue's Paradise, Crime and Punishment in Antebellum, Florida, 1821 to 1861. Dr. Denham's article explores criminal activity in Antebellum, Pensacola, including frequency of crimes committed and prosecution of criminals. He surveys patterns of lawbreaking and the problems associated with housing criminals and enforcing the law in his article titled Crime and Punishment in Antebellum, Florida. In addition to Dr. Denham's article, this volume contains the 2010 Friends of the Florida Historical Society Keynote lecture by distinguished Florida historian and University of Florida Professor Emeritus Michael Gannon. Titled The First Coming of Judeo-Christian Religion to Florida, Dr. Gannon's article traces the development of religious beliefs and religious institutions in Florida from the pre-Columbian worship of Native Americans to the Spanish priests who arrived in the 16th century, through the Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and Jews of the 18th and 19th centuries. Dr. Irvin Winsboro and William B. Mack authored Blue Water, Brown Water, and Confederate Disloyalty, the peculiar personal naval conflict in South Florida during the Civil War. This study offers a fresh interpretation of the recognized naval land war in South Florida during the Civil War. The authors offer new material on black seamen in Florida's Civil War and analyze the complex and shifting roles of Union men, Confederate apostates, deserters, and refugees. The final article was written by Mark Newman, a reader at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. The title is The Catholic Diocese of Miami and African American Desegregation, 1958 to 1977. His research analyzes the work of Bishop Coleman F. Carroll and his efforts for desegregation of parochial schools and churches. Newman argues that although Catholic institutions desegregated, the result was seldom integration based on reciprocity between the races. Displeased by the closing of black Catholic institutions, many African Americans eventually left the church. In addition to the interview with Dr. Denham, this podcast will also include a discussion with Dr. Raymond Mohl, a professor of history at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Professor Mohl may be familiar to many of you from his tenure at Florida Atlantic University. Dr. Mohl will be talking about his memories of Stetson Kennedy, who died at age 94 on August 27, 2011. Stetson Kennedy was a historian and social activist whose career spanned 8 decades of U.S. and Florida history. He collected oral histories of Floridians for the Federal Writers Project during the New Deal, infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan, and exposed its activities in the 1950s. Championed civil rights throughout his long career, and worked to end global slavery in his last days. His books included Palmetto Country, Southern Exposure, The Klan Unmasked, and The Florida Slave. Dr. Daniel Murphy, an associate professor at the University of Central Florida and the assistant editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, conducted the interview with Dr. Denham. Dr. Robert Casanello, assistant professor at the University of Central Florida, conducted the interview with Dr. Mohl. Due to technical difficulties, the interview with Dr. Mohl is not as clear as previous episodes.
Professor Denham, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is James M Denham, and I teach history at Florida Southern College. Director of the Lawton Chiles Center for Florida History at Florida Southern College, and I'm also a professor of history.
In your recently published article for the Florida Historical Quarterly, you discussed the prevalence of crime in Pensacola during the antebellum period. Compared to modern society, was Pensacola during the antebellum period an extremely violent community?
That's hard to say, really. It is a Pensacola, as well as all antebellum South communities and also port communities, were extremely violent. I would say that if you look at the incidence of crime on, let's say, on court minute book kind of level, in other words, how many indictments are there for violent crime per year, per capita of the population, I would say absolutely it was more violent than today. And we can get into the details of how that breaks down at the time later. But I would say, yes, violent. No, it was far more violent than it is today.
Well, how did Pensacola's crime during this period differ from other states in the South and other regions of the U.S.?
Well, it didn't differ a whole lot from Florida or other villages in the antebellum South. In fact, it was very similar. Almost all the studies of counties or localities that studied these kinds of things and subjected the minute book, the level of prosecutions, that is what historical court records we have available, almost all of the communities in the antebellum South reflect this tremendous amount of violence. And, of course, by violence I mean prosecutions for assault and battery, and then obviously the big violent crime, murder. So while the prosecutions were extensive and very numerous, they weren't necessarily prosecuted that severely.
Kind of looking at it a different way, how did law enforcement in antebellum Pensacola generally deal with crime, and was the criminal justice system effective in its efforts to reduce crime?
The answer to that is the criminal justice system was really almost non-existent as we would know it today. There was no real systematic criminal justice system. There was a sheriff or a U.S. Marshal in the territorial period who was responsible for the entire judicial district, which would have included all of the counties west of the Apalachicola River, for example, or West Florida, and then there were sheriffs. But these individuals were extremely, well, when you say trained, they didn't have any training whatsoever, and there was very little tax dollars or resources given to these people to actually control crime in the kind of way that we're used to seeing it all. In fact, that's one of the things that really also is theme, and that is that the general public was expected to participate in the actual capture and even in some cases housing of lawbreakers. So it was extremely rudimentary. There really was no criminal justice system per se. And you'll notice that I think it's in the second page of that article, I quote William Hazel Hunt, who is one of the newspaper editors. He was a newspaper editor for the Pensacola Gazette, who basically says that in one of his editorials. He says, our system of jurisprudence is pretty much a dead letter, in that there was really no systematic process for dealing with law breaking, that is at the local level.
Just to follow up, when was the system created? When did the situation begin to change?
Well, into the 20th century with the progressive era in the late 19th century, you began to get a more sophisticated approach given to law enforcement and criminal justice. Of course, Florida never had a penitentiary until after the Civil War. And the penitentiary system, of course, which is a kind of an antebellum reform, we think of the Auburn system in New York State. That was kind of a New England approach. And in the South, it was less regimented. Of course, on the other hand, states like Alabama and Georgia had penitentiaries, but mainly it was a kind of a work process by which criminals would be sentenced to a penitentiary, and they would work and do the kind of things that we associate today with, like the chain gang and the 20th century work activities and so forth. Florida never had any of that until way on into the Reconstruction period.
More about the article itself. How does your research itself, how does your research for this article reflect your overall research agenda?
I'm not sure if I have an agenda or a research agenda. I've tried to look at crime from every different standpoint breaking it down, for example, into crime against person, crime against property, and then in third category, crime against public order and morality, which was kind of a 19th century kind of approach and pre-19th century kind of approach to things like fornication and adultery, or things today which would be practically ignored in our criminal justice system. Classify myself as a social historian, and then I'm most interested in people and the way that people interact. And also, I think historians need to tell a story. Otherwise, you put people to sleep.
Well, in that regard, do you have any specific future research projects you're working on that deal with Florida history?
The real void out there, if you look at what's been done regarding history of crime and punishment in Florida, is nobody's really done much at all with the Reconstruction to Progressive Era period. There's been some good work on the penitentiary and pardons and so forth. Vivian Miller, for example, has written some great stuff on that. But what I'd like to do eventually is do the same kind of systematic research that I did for the antebellum era. I'd really like to do that with Reconstruction up to, say, the turn of the century, because that would be a tremendously interesting study. Basically the same format that I did with Rogue's Paradise. For example, go to each county and make a survey of the court records available and take note. Of course, there's a lot more material at that point. There's more counties. I think when I did Rogue's Paradise, there were only about 15 counties. If that would be, I guess, a lifetime project to do the same kind of thing. But my current research also, I've got a manuscript finished on Governor William Pope Duval, which I've been working on for many, many years. Plus, I'm working on a history of the Middle District Court of Florida.
So you're definitely busy then.
Yeah, I'm very busy.
Well, final question. What advice would you give to future graduate students or current graduate students interested in researching Florida's past?
First thing I would say is it's wide open. Florida is practically untapped. There's so many neat things you can study and explore in Florida that really nobody has really done much with at all. For example, I was just looking at the Florida Historical Quarterly the other night. The most recent issue has Mike Gannon's wonderful essay that he gave about religion in Florida. Of course, in Florida was really the beginning of the Christian religion here in North America. But he kind of calls out for an agenda. He says nobody's written anything to amount to anything on religion in the Civil War. Of course, we're on our 150th anniversary of the Civil War now, and nobody's even written much at all about the Civil War in Florida. We've got some good books on women in the Civil War. We've got some pretty good books in Florida. We've got some pretty good books on various campaigns in Florida during the Civil War. But something like religion in Florida during the Civil War is really undone and not done at all. It's an exciting venture. Florida history is, again, wide open.
Great. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Okay. Well, good to be with you, Dan.
Okay. It's great to be talking with you again, Dr. Mohl. Now, we're talking about the life and legacy and career of Stetson Kennedy. Could you tell us how you got to know him?
I guess I first learned about Stetson in doing my research for my book on Miami, especially about race relations in the post-war era. And his name kept popping up in the bibliography, articles he was writing in the Nation magazine and other places about race relations in Miami. He did a series of three important articles in 1951 and 52 about the Miami bombings, and then later the killing of Harry T. Moore. So they were really hard-hitting articles and nailed home for me the reality that Miami at that point was still a deep South city, even though it was changing with a lot of migration from the north, Jews and Italians, people who were sort of bringing in liberal politics, but it was still deep South. Everything was completely segregated. So that's how I first learned about him. I met him for the first time in the mid-'80s when the Florida Humanities Council had a conference in Fort Lauderdale, conference on the WPA Writers Project and the books that they published. And, of course, Stetson was involved as the Florida guide. And he was there giving a talk, and I met him a few times. I don't think he ever remembered me after that. but certainly it was the first time I actually met him later on. During that period also, in the late 80s, I was on the FAU press board. This is a time when the University Press of Florida had decentralized, so every campus had its own imprint within the Florida University Press system. We decided to do as much as we could during that period. We wanted to make our mark, show that we could publish some good books. And I thought about reprinting some of the books of Zora Neale Hurston and also Stetson Kennedy. It turned out that the Hurston books were taken up by Skip Gates at Harvard, and he was reprinting all those books as a trade publisher. But we were successful in getting the go-ahead to reprint 3 of Stetson's books at the FAU Press, including Southern Exposure, which was a real hard-hitting expose of the racist organizations in the South, the Jim Crow Guide, and the Klan Unmasked. All 3 of those books were published in the early 90s by the FAU Press. Well, when Stetson found out that before they were published, the FAU Press was going to publish these, and that I was pushing it, he gave me a call, and I was looking at my files just the other day, and I got a phone call from Stetson in 1989. He wanted to thank me for promoting his books with the press, but also then we had a long conversation about my research and his connection with some of the civil rights activists in Miami, the subject I was working on at the time. And that led to a long series of exchange of letters all through the early 90s, up to about 1996 when I left FAU to come to UAB. So I have a lot of correspondence with Stetson back and forth during that period. I was sending him some of my research as I was writing it up. And he was sending me stuff from his own files, copies of things that he had collected. He was an inveterate collector of news clippings and magazine articles and things like that. So I have a lot of stuff that he sent me from his own files. I'm not sure if they were the only. They must have been copies.
We have about 8,000 subscribers to the Florida Historical Podcast. I would imagine a majority of them probably don't know who Stetson Kennedy is until this interview. So if you were to give them some advice about where to search first to learn about Stetson Kennedy, where would you direct them?
Well, I would go to the 4 major books that he published. Stetson had a very creative period in the 40s. I mean, he was active even right 30s, as a late 30s as law student at the University of Florida. He was extremely successful in publishing during the 40s. There are 4 big books that people could look at. One would be the Palmetto Country, which was a book about Florida, its culture, its regional culture. It was part of a big series that was being published by trade publishers about regional cultures throughout the country. So that was an expansion of some of the work that he had done on the WPA Writers Project in Florida. He was one of the main interviewers and people putting together that collection. He, along with Zora Neale Hurston and several other people. You might also go to the Florida WPA Guide, which he had a big hand in. So those are two beginning points. But his major work, I think, in fighting against the racist South, promoting equal justice for African Americans, would be Southern Exposure. Really important book. And it's a journalistic kind of a book. It's not the kind of a book a historian would write, but it had a lot of good, solid information about these racist groups in the South. And a lot's been made of Stetson's efforts to get involved with the Klan as a sort of undercover investigative journalist working inside the Klan. And he did do a lot of writing of this based on these kinds of things all through the early 40s. He was writing articles in the Nation, as I said, and the Republic, Southern Frontier, but he was mostly writing columns for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a black newspaper in Pittsburgh, but it was one of the 2 national black newspapers. It was distributed by Pullman porters all over the country, along with the Chicago Defender. So he was a Florida correspondent for the Pittsburgh Courier, and he was writing articles about the Klan and about civil rights and things of that sort. Some of my dealings with Stetson, I urged him to pull together a lot of that journalism from the Courier and maybe from other papers. And apparently he did prepare something. He has had a manuscript that he showed me one time called Up North, Down South, which would have been a collection of his essays. I wonder whatever happened to that. But anyway, those are places where you could start. The Meadow Country, the Florida Guide, and Southern Exposure.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Mohl, for talking with me today.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I hope this is helpful for people who want to learn a little bit about Stetson, who had an important impact on the study of Florida.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. Our listener statistics tell us that we have podcast subscribers in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the Quarterly are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you've enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Go to www.myfloridahistory.org for membership details. In addition, you can follow the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, and researchers can access back issues of the Quarterly on JSTOR.